The Mindset Advantage, a podcast by Arcadia Consulting, architects of change.
Change is a journey from loss to thriving in a new world. Along that journey, people experience many challenging emotions before they pivot towards the new future. In this episode, Steve Ellis is joined by Oliemata O'Donoghue to explore how resilience is a critical attribute and capability as we move from old to new, and how developing resilience can help people through change.
Hi everybody, my name is Steve Ellis. I am a director, partner of Arcadia Consulting. I run our European business based here in the UK. I am delighted to be joined today by Ollie O'Donoghue from HSBC. Ollie, why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Firstly, thank you, Steve. I'm very delighted to be here. I'm even more delighted that you call me Ollie, as my full name is Oliemata. So I like being called Ollie. I am a senior leader in financial services with 20 years experience in leadership. I am passionate about growing people, driving strategic change, and driving wider societal impact in our communities. I am also a coach, a mentor, a student for life, and I enjoy supporting the future generations who are aspiring to be leaders and change makers. I am very passionate about driving inclusion and proactively work with employee resource groups, business leaders to drive meaningful change. On a more personal level, I'm married with 2 amazing teenagers. I love spending time with my family and friends. I am a big food lover, especially with anything that's got chocolate on it. And I enjoy taking long walks, as well as having a Netflix and chill weekend on those cold and wet days.
Oh, which happens a lot, of course. Oh, fantastic. It sounds like a typical person listening to this podcast, you know, family, activities, work, passions. So delighted to have you join the podcast series. Today's podcast is all about resilience, particularly resilience as individuals, teams, organizations, families go through, which is often the case, goes through change. And, in what way does resilience help, or the development of resilience help people to go through change? So on that topic, Ollie, when you hear the word resilience, what does that word mean? Not academically and not based on a dictionary, but what does that word mean for you?
Thanks, Steve. I think it's actually important to talk about the definition into what the dictionary says it means, and then I'll put my own perspective into it. So the definition of resilience is our ability to withstand adversity and bounce back from difficult life events. My perspective is that also being resilient does not mean that people do not express stress, emotional upheaval, and suffering, which is one of the biggest misconceptions out there. Just to give you an example from my experience, I find that resilient people tap into their strength and support system to overcome challenges and work through problems. Moreover, it is important for people to go through that change curve and for leaders to recognize and give care and show empathy. My favorite saying is that we don't all cross the line together at the same pace. We have to bring people with us along the journey. So that's my little twist on resilience.
That's great. I really liked your comment there almost instantly, which was, it's not juxtaposed to the definition, which is about coping in adversity, absorbing stress and bouncing back. You almost dived into a strategy of resilience that the best people, I think, that are able to be more resilient actually tap into, which was being open about the stress, being open about the difficulty, almost speaking it out as actually a part of being resilient and helping individuals cope. And then the second strategy you mentioned, I think, was that one of really leaning into your strengths. So yeah, I really appreciate that distinction and that nuance around resilience. I guess we wouldn't need it if there wasn't stuff going on in the world. We wouldn't need resilience if everything was sweet and nice all the time. So it's usually triggered, or the demand for resilience is usually triggered by some kind of event, some kind of change, some kind of challenge or difficulty, which could be as big as COVID and as and as small as being stuck in traffic, as important as organizational change, and a subset of organizational change might simply be the acquisition of a new skill or a new behavior, or you're learning something. I'm curious to get your perspective on the role that you think people with resilience or resilience plays in change, whether that be HSBC organizational change, role change, or sociological change, family change. How would you see the role that resilience plays?
Steve, I'm delighted that actually you started off with change and the different lens on change, because I'm of the mindset that it's almost irrelevant, the size of the change. The only person that can judge that is the individual and how they feel about that change. So let me talk a little bit around the role we play in the change process and the change curve. So change is a journey from loss to thriving into a new world. Along that journey, people experience many emotions, including anger, frustration, confusion, sadness, depression. They go into crisis mode. Some people get excitement from it and they get a sense of urgency to act before they pivot towards the future and the new world, or ways of working, behavior, skill, and more. Resilience is a critical attribute and capability as we pivot from old to new in change. From a neuroscience perspective, is the shift from operating our implicit memory of old habits, feeling of safety, comfort associated with those habits, ways of working and relationships to the new habit development using the explicit memory system. Let me unpack one of the areas for you. So if we take the example of feeling of safety, this has really tested our resilience in the last 15 months. With the sudden changes of the new norm we experienced with the pandemic. I have seen vulnerabilities manifest in so many different guises, from how we shifted from changes to how we lived our lives on a day-to-day basis, to suddenly altering our norms. We saw fear, we saw paranoia, we saw anxiety levels rising, where we engage in simple day-to-day activities like buying groceries or essential items. Our homes became our classrooms. Our workplace became our homes. This has really tested us. In summary, change and resilience and well-being have to work hand in hand with very strong acute sense of responsibilities by leaders to observe and act. I'm going to repeat that. By a very acute sense of responsibilities by leaders to observe and act, especially in the workplace. And in that context, Steve.
Love that. And the fact, I know why you repeated it. Well, I don't know why you repeated it, but it resonated with me. So I wanted it to get repeated, which was that acute sense of responsibility. That's a really powerful sentence. Sense of responsibility, acute sense of responsibility, and for leaders to act. And I liked your connection between change, well-being, and resilience. That's it's almost impossible to disconnect those things. And I would argue leaders' acute responsibility for well-being and to develop people's resilience inevitably helps them to feel safer versus scared, in control versus paranoid, with the words you use, as they go through that particular change curve. So really appreciate that. Help me to understand how you've seen this play out for individuals, or teams going through change in your organization or in your life or in the world around you. How have you seen, I guess, the negative of paranoia and fear play out, but also how have you seen resilience play out? Also, forgive me for stacking up this question, how you've seen leadership, that acute sense of responsibility and leadership play out for individuals and teams.
Yes, sure, Steve. Let me take the first part and then I will come into talking about how I've seen it manifested, especially internally, meaning workplace, but also externally in our day-to-day life. Well, at that pivot point is a period of huge effort demanded to take on the new habits. It's a time that amplifies your fear of failure, rejection and judgment when we fail. And you are more likely to feel conflicted about what is right, but also what is wrong. when we are not clear about whether the way forward is right or wrong, and when we attempt to move forward and fail, all the evidence suggests it's wrong. And again, we dream of the good old days. Underpinning resilience is control and choice. At this point of change, we can feel out of control and as such become victims. We feel helpless and can focus more on blaming others. So if I turn around and just share a bit of how this is manifested, especially from leaders observing, the first bit that I'm going to say is talk to leaders directly, actually, and say to leaders, it's absolutely okay to actually show vulnerabilities yourself, because I think that it's important that leaders get into this frame of getting rid of this superhero cape that you constantly have to wear, because it's not realistic to be a superhero constantly. Personally, for me, I will hate to be the one that says, I know it all, I see it all, I'm perfect, because I'm absolutely not perfect. The same feelings that people will experience as we're going through change, whether it's small or it's a big change, is exactly how I feel as a leader. So it's important that we normalize that firstly. And also leaders need to focus on keeping a very, very tight attention of their environment and people that surround them. And the reason I am saying that is you can actually differentiate between the behavior of someone that you see every day and when they shift to a different kind of behavior. So by noticing that, it's important that you directly, have conversation with that individual just to find out, just that duty of care and empathy needs to kick in. How you doing is one of the best questions you can ask. And when you don't get the answer, ask again. If you don't get it, ask again. Because at some point, the individual will know that you care enough to ask how they're doing. So I think that's really important for leaders to be totally aware of that. And in the external environment as well. Later on, I'll talk a little bit around how my own children have helped me transition from suddenly being out there running 1,000 miles per hour to actually working from home where they could see me 24/7 and how they've helped me. So on external as well, it's important to look after your community. I'm big on community. I'm big on social factors. During the pandemic, we've seen people that were shielding, that they have been at home. Some people have relatives that they actually can come in and help them. Some people don't. So I've really exercised that bit around being neighborly, because I know my neighborhood, in terms of knocking on doors of elderly people that I know are actually quite lonely, to take responsibility of doing simple tasks for them, like going shopping, which they could no longer do, or just waving at the window to them through the window to get that interaction. So there's a lot here, Steve, to talk about, but I think I've picked on two of the elements that is significant for me personally.
Superb. I'm going to pick up on, just for me personally, on that first one you mentioned, which was about leaders being vulnerable. And you used a lovely phrase, which was removing the superhero cape and letting go of this idea of being perfect. I think that's so powerful on many levels. I think it's really powerful for the leader themselves and their own well-being and their own fears around the change or what's coming next. I think that's really useful for them. Secondly, I think, especially as people are trying new habits, new skills, new ways of working, going through the acquisition of new habits where we do experience failure, it doesn't work first time. I think it gives people a sense of security and a sense of safety to know that actually there's not a massive expectation to be perfect. So by seeing my parent or by seeing my leader or by seeing my colleague acknowledge that nobody, including them, has to be a superhero or be perfect, I think that enables me to experiment a little bit. It makes me sort of think, I can give this a go, and if it doesn't work first time, that's okay, because my boss has just said it's okay to be imperfect. So I think that vulnerability thing works both for the leader, but also communicates a culture that enables experimentation and a degree of understanding about not being perfect first time. I think that's a really powerful distinction. I like the way you used it, paying tight attention on the environment and a duty of care to be empathic and asking that question, how are you doing? I love, by the way, the follow-up. No, really, how are you doing? And if I don't get an answer or a deeper answer, then I'm going to ask the question and almost until I do. And I think it's a duty of care to find out how people really are. And I think this neighbourly allyship can play a part both outside of work, in the neighbourhood, by calling on your neighbours and checking up on them and giving them support. But that could easily show up in HSBC, right? That could show up in any organisation that sort of says, especially as a leader, but even as a colleague, I should be an ally or a neighbour to my colleagues and just check in on them. And how are you doing? Can I help you with something? I know that this is multidimensional. It's not just about work. It's about homeschooling, or it's about what's going on in your community or what's going on in your team. So I really like that vulnerability, that paying attention and checking in on people. And that idea of being neighbourly and an ally to your colleagues, or indeed in society to your neighbours, a good piece of advice for anybody listening. I think that's super useful. I'm curious to get your thoughts on whether you think resilience can be developed. Is it as a parent, you mentioned you've got teenage kids. To what extent are you developing them? You're a leader in HSBC. To what extent is it developable in your colleagues at work? I often hear the phrases, some people are, tough, or some people are not. And it's almost stated as if it's a genetic fixed fact, and it can't be changed in any way. So curious to get your thoughts on whether you think resilience is something that can be developed and grown in people.
I think just pausing to reflect, the simple answer I can give to this is absolutely, resilience can be developed. Mindsets have always been teachable. Ask any parent and they spend years developing their children's perspective, mindsets, confidence, and resilience. The focus is on giving back control and choice, helping people manage perspective, reframe failure as a learning, difficulty as opportunity, and processing situation to see what they can control and that they can choose their responses. It's about empowerment and control over their behaviors. Let me share some examples where I've seen real success in the workplace and also at home. So again, in the workplace context, leaders that are very aware of the part they play can make a significant difference in helping teams develop resilience by taking intentional and purposeful actions, such as getting to know their teams individually and understanding how they can help them enhance their coping mechanism. This can be done by giving positive recognition to people. It can also be done by picking up on the clues you get from small banter, because that really allows you to know your individual and what's important to them. You can also provide growth mindset training. There's some fantastic resources out there and tools that are readily available. Taking notice on shift in behavior and seeking to understand the driver for the individual, not the driver for you as a leader, but the driver for the individual is really important in helping them build their own coping mechanism. It's got to be their own and not yours as a leader. So absolutely, it is teachable, and you can develop resilience, but people that surround you have a part to play to support you along that journey, and leaders in this context. So if I take another example, which is at home, close family members that know you very well tend to notice your shift in behaviors quickly. I will take my children as an example. On occasions where I find myself displaying my imposter syndromes, I'm owning it because I think we need to normalize imposter syndromes. It's real. This can sometimes impact my resilience sometimes. My children have been very quick in reminding me of looking on the brighter side of life. Children have this way of actually this optimism, that exists, and they're good. They'll press that button to really make you see details. And if you're shut on just that conversation with your family, I found that my children actually are far more resourceful at their age than I was when I was a teenager, because information is so readily available to them. So at the press of the button, they'll talk to you, but they'll also show it to you in your face to say, take a look at this, read this, this is how it's done. I think that's been really helpful for me personally. I have found that extremely valuable during the pandemic when I needed to adjust very, very quickly from traveling a lot, being on the road, to now constantly sitting in one room, and supporting my team to the best that I can, but also supporting myself and my own mental health, and my well-being as well.
I love that story. Kids are amazing, aren't they? They're so good at reframing, looking on the bright side, calling it out. They have what we might call sensory acuity, because they just notice it as well. They're really good at noticing when mum and dad are a little bit bent out of shape by whatever's going on, and then suddenly calling it out. That's fantastic.
Steve, I do want to go back before we move on and just share some self-help stuff that I personally saw recently. So I recently came across a talk on this topic, and it really resonated with me personally. The speaker shared 3 actions that can help you cope. And here they are. Here's my gift to the audience. So number 1 is resilient people get that adversities happen and suffering is part of human existence. It does not mean that they welcome it. They know that suffering is part of life. And knowing this makes you feel that terrible things happen to people. We live in an age where perfection is displayed everywhere and it's the norm. And I quite simply know that it's not true. Setting expectation of perfection is not real, whatsoever. The second point the speaker shared was resilient people are good at focusing their emotions and energy on what is within their control and accept very quickly things they cannot change to manage their mental well-being. This is a very vital learnable skills. The third point is negative emotion sticks to us. We are surrounded by threats and constant change. Resilient people do not diminish the negative anxieties that comes with unfamiliar territories, but have worked out the art of tuning into the positive. I felt that this was very simple, useful perspective and an outlook in life, and I wanted to share it with the audience.
That is great. There's a certain acceptance in point number 1. Stuff happens, right? And it's not personal. It's not about me. I don't need to feel like it's the world, picking on me, and I don't have to be perfect. I love that. I love point number 2, which was the idea of control the controllables and direct your emotions and your activities to those things that are inside your control. And then point number 2, I love that, which was sort of reframing, right? And I love that phrase, negative emotions can sometimes stick to us, but how do we reframe and look on the bright side and see what could be good, which goes back to what your kids obviously have been helping you with. I think that probably underpins a lot of our challenge around change and a lot of our challenge around how we respond to change is this idea that it's happening to us and that we feel sometimes that we've lost all sense of control or all sense of choice over what we do and what we say next. And if we feel like control is happening to us, then we just sit there passively and let it happen to us and get hurt by it. But if you can give, and you used the word earlier, empowerment, if you can give people this idea that there are still some choices and you can control some things, so put your attention onto those things that you can control and realize that you don't have to be perfect. And we mentioned earlier the idea of the leader showing vulnerability to even role model that imperfection is a really super good thing to do. So yeah, I like whoever that speaker was. They were clearly very profound. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And I guess those things that you've just described, they can be done whenever you like, right? That idea of acceptance, that idea of reframing, that idea of controlling the controllables, those strategies that you've shared, they can be done whenever you like, right? And for change, as you mentioned at the top of the call, of any size or shape.
I think the short answer is no. It's important that we're realistic. Resilience has the tone of tough love and shouldn't be done in the early phase of change, where greater leadership care and sensitivity needs to be shown. That's a very important point to recognize. I think we touched on earlier that people don't get to the same place together and at the same pace. So it's really important to recognize whether that person is ready to start that journey of building resilience, and in simple children's language, not boo-boo how they're feeling, whatsoever.
Actually, that's a really good call. As we've learned in the podcast series, yes, people do go through the change curve at different rates, and different mindsets are useful at different parts of that change curve. So, giving them tough love, or giving yourself some tough love, and sort of helping you to cope with things, well, that's okay when you're ready to do that. And it's okay, or we've heard the phrase, it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to feel uncomfortable. And when that's the case, we need to over-index on empathy and leadership care and understanding before we get into that transition to, right, now let's cope with the real world. Now let's control the controllables. Let's reframe the situation in order to start driving new actions. Well, I'll start driving new actions when I'm ready to start driving new actions. Don't push me into that resilient space too early. Give me some love, attention, and care would be super helpful. Brilliant. I think resilience is such an important topic, not least because of the pandemic, but because organizations, and it's a cliche, I know, the only constant is change. And if that is true, and I believe it's true, and I believe it's actually going to accelerate and become even more prevalent in our lives as we take on new digital technology, as we respond to the pandemic, as organizations reshape the way that they work, as society reshapes the way that it lives. Inevitably, we're going to be going through more and more change. And if that's the case, then resilience becomes an even more important topic and an important skill or attribute for people to be able to deal with that. And we're already witnessing, unfortunately, some people that have struggled with that and the growth in mental health challenges. So I think it's something that will show itself continually, not just post the pandemic, but across many changes that are going on in our lives. Ollie, thank you very much for joining. Just before we exit the podcast, any final comments from you as it relates to your own experience with resilience and any final words of wisdom and advice for our listeners?
Yes, sure, Steve. Just additional things for takeout for people in terms of what can you do if you're a leader to build resilience. So here's 5 tips. The first one is balance the belief and hope of the team with necessary action required to deal with the reality of change. The second is provide resilience mindset training and development. There's loads of resources available. Third one is, just to reiterate, control the controllable versus focusing on your concerns. And the last 2 are my personal favorite. It is okay for leaders to show vulnerabilities as this humanizes them. Finally, be present, show care, and show empathy. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Ollie. And those 5 bullet points there were a really nice close for the listeners. Really good advice. And thank you once again for joining the podcast series. We really appreciate it, Ollie. So thanks, everybody, for listening. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the Mindset Advantage podcast series. It's available on all the usual podcast platforms. And look forward to you joining this series in the future. All the best. Have a fantastic day.
You've been listening to The Mindset Advantage. Follow Arcadia Consulting on social media platforms to stay updated.